Hey, it's a very weird Monday, January 5th. We're all back from the holiday break to the very odd news that no one has learned anything about colonialism, and we're all about to go right back to some of the worst instincts of some very deluded people once upon a time. This is going to be a look at the history of oil and colonialism. It's a little bit of a departure for me, but it's actually something that I've studied. This was my focus as a student. And so I'm going to be breaking down for you why, when I hear these people in their suits and their ties talking about this time going to be different, that the United States is somehow going to improve another country by taking it over and taking advantage of its oil revenues, I don't hear a plan. What I hear is the opening chapters of a very old and very predictable financial tragedy. So on Saturday, we all woke up to the news that Nicolás Maduro was rendered here to the United States after the Delta Force soldiers came in, took him and his wife, and brought them first to an aircraft carrier and then on to New York City, where he will be tried under our laws, not his. Now, this is not, of course, a defense of this guy. This guy, by all accounts, was a nightmare. Hugo Chavez, who was elected democratically, had already begun to run the economy in Venezuela into the ground when Maduro came along and became, just as oppressive and vastly more incompetent, and has taken what was a, fairly thriving economy, considering it sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, and drove it into the ground. Right, total infrastructure collapse in this place, such that, as one political scientist writing in the New York Times this weekend put it, the government is really only about keeping itself going. It doesn't provide any essential services to anybody else. So when I look back at, the plea or the case that we've heard President Trump making here is that somehow, as he stood on the podium, gesturing at the people behind him, saying these guys are going to essentially run Venezuela from now on, he openly talked about what we typically don't hear about, which is the financial motivation for something like this. He talked again and again about the oil reserves that are available in Venezuela, and that U.S. companies being made, having the pavement made smooth for them into that country by American troops, will somehow bring riches to that country and presumably to, I guess, the United States, perhaps only to the president and his family personally. I don't really know what the plan is there, but I can tell you there is a long, long history of this going terribly, terribly wrong, and it being, in the end, of just a really, really bad idea. You'll remember, of course, this, right? This was the invasion of Iraq. This is a shot from 2003 when American troops were charged with, guarding the burning oil fields of Iraq. And this was, of course, pitched as a way of securing oil, stabilizing markets, and, of course, the most public pitch being made was that we would reshape the region and make this a much more sort of democratic and stable environment. The reality, of course, was that we saw trillions, literally trillions, in war and veteran costs that are ongoing, right? Our entanglement was incredibly painful financially for the United States, and, of course, did not result in any of the promised democratic reforms we were hoping for in Iraq. Iraq became, if anything, less stable than it had been under Saddam. Not defending Saddam, but that was a fairly stable, and it was also the only secular leadership in that region when we decided to take all of that out. In the end, even though it wasn't openly discussed that oil was the purpose of this invasion, it of course was. And for the cynical folks thinking that they would somehow take advantage of that, there was no oil windfall for the U.S. Treasury. It did not work in creating a stable, America-friendly oil market. Instead, here in the United States, we enjoyed much, much higher deficits because of the war spending we had to undertake, and there were zero price controls imposed. We did not gain any kind of leverage over the world oil markets in the end. And so we didn't take Iraq's oil. We just took on the incredible expense of operating there. We essentially took on Iraq's, the costs of Iraq, the bills of Iraq. That ended up being the thing. So that's the one that we here in the United States know best, right, is that one. But the one that we, know less well, I would argue, is the Suez crisis, in which we saw, let's see here. Here we go. The Suez crisis. So back in the 50s, at the end of its colonial power, Britain saw Egypt suddenly nationalize the Suez Canal, creating national control for the first time over this very, very powerful oil choke point. It was the place through which so much moved. And as a result, Britain invaded along with Israel and created an effort to try to hang on to this very, very important part of what had been Britain's colonial access to oil. It created an absolute financial disaster for Britain. First of all, Britain very quickly figured out that it couldn't actually make this move unilaterally without the consent of the United States. And we did not approve. And as a result, Britain was humiliated on the world stage. They also wound up having to basically retreat under U.S. pressure. And all of it in the meantime created incredible costs that Britain could not handle. It led to a sterling crisis, a crisis in the value of the pound in England. And in the end, the International Monetary Fund had to bail England out. And the currency markets that were in charge of basically Britain's power at that time were really who held the power when it came to oil power, and the idea that Britain had that it would somehow, return to this kind of colonial footing and have some control through troops of this important asset turned out to not be affordable anymore. And historians really talk about this as being sort of the end of the colonial era of Britain as a power. Here's the port of Said being bombed at that time. Just a total disaster for Britain in thinking that it could go in and throw its weight around and hang on to this. Then there's another classic case. This one looks like it could be, anywhere in the world. Could be, this could be Venezuela. This could be Iraq. This was, in fact, Algeria, right? This is France going into Algeria. And this was another case in which a colonist, a colonial power, France, wanted to somehow keep Algeria, wanted to keep its oil, keep its territory, and France had all kinds of weird national prestige notions sort of built up in this. It created, of course, massive military spending. It created huge inflation back in France and created a total political crisis that collapsed the Fourth Republic in France. It was a total nightmare. And they treated Algeria as domestic infrastructure, right? But wound up paying enormous domestic prices for what was essentially a colonial war, and a very, very terrible one that killed hundreds of thousands of Algerians and tens of thousands of French troops. Nightmare. All right, last one is Nigeria, where the Netherlands, again, also a post-colonial country trying to hang on to its oil profits without a formal empire, tried to basically give carte blanche to its own companies to extract as much wealth as they possibly could from Nigeria's reserves of oil, and in the process created a disaster. This is some of the area that was environmentally destroyed, croplands turned into a sludgy nightmare by companies like Shell, who wound up the subject of big international outcry and, more importantly, big international lawsuits, which wound their ways into Dutch courts, wound up costing these companies an incredible amount of money, and created a huge reputational and financial blowback for the country at home. And this is, again, the Netherlands not quite invading Nigeria. They gave just sort of carte blanche to their companies to do so. But Nigeria's oil liabilities and the incredible environmental liabilities that these companies created wound up invading the Netherlands and creating this incredible nightmare. So what we're seeing here with the rendition of Nicolás Maduro and this crazy talk about somehow controlling Venezuela is what we clearly have not learned, what none of these guys standing behind Trump at the podium have learned, and certainly Trump himself doesn't seem to have, is that oil revenues only go one of two ways. They either stay local to the physical place they are in, or they go corporate. They do not in any way accrue back to the country that facilitates a kind of grab of oil revenues. The costs, however, wind up being national. And the fantasies that people in power have about controlling this resource wind up outpacing economic reality every time. You literally cannot nationalize the upside, and you certainly can't outsource the risks. You wind up just eating the risks, without the chance to chew on them. You choke on that, absolutely. And so again, when I hear this sort of casual talk about the U.S. taking over Venezuela, which is a country with collapsing infrastructure, has been, it's a country that's held under sanctions, has a long history of political corruption, deep political instability. There is no clean mechanism at all for the profits from letting American companies in there and somehow holding that the necessary infrastructure with U.S. troops. There's no clear mechanism for any of that to flow back to U.S. taxpayers, even if we wanted to, right? I mean, this is taking all the morality out of it. This is just talking about the money and the way in which money might flow back to the United States. Every oil empire thinks that this time is going to be different. And in the end, every spreadsheet always collapses under the weight of it. And yet again, we are facing this down without any clear sense that we have learned anything from more than 100 years of absolute debacles when it comes to colonial impulses and oil. The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.